And that's a good thing. So one of the big things that the governor is pushing is he wants to propose, or he's proposing a constitutional amendment which would make major changes to the rainy day fund that was established in 2004 under the Schwarzenegger administration. One of the reasons that we even have the rainy day fund is to help stabilize us through difficult periods when the economy is not doing as well, revenues drop for whatever reason. But one of the big reasons is there's a lot of volatility. There's great fluctuation in the capital gains tax, and of course that comes from like going public with Facebook or Twitter and some other things. And so what happens is that we have this surge of revenues, and then a lot of people want to give those revenues out. They want to spend those revenues. And we're not going to expect them the following year. So what he wants to do, and that's the second, here's some specifics about the rainy day fund, is when those revenues, when the capital gains revenues exceed 6.5% of the general fund taxes, then he wants to take those funds and put them into this rainy day fund. And in addition, currently, the rainy day fund can only be a maximum of 5% of the total revenues that the state has in a year, the basically average revenues. He wants to double that to 10%. And then also, in lieu of maybe putting funds into that rainy day fund, he's saying that if we have like big debt that we want to pay off, this one-time big debt, that we could pay off that big debt in lieu of putting the money into those funds. And then if we had when we had bad years, the first year of a recession, we wouldn't be allowed to take any more than 50% of the funds that have been saved up in that rainy day fund. And then this first bullet, which in a way kind of might be the last bullet, he wants to add an additional part to that rainy day fund that is specifically for Prop 98, specifically for education, so that these other funds would be for all different areas of the state budget, but have a specific area for education. So we'll see how that plays out. We'll see if he gets it on the ballot, and that requires either 2/3 legislative vote or 8% of signatures of voting, the voting population that voted in the last gubernatorial election. So of this budget, what are we looking at in education? Well, Prop 98 has a huge gain. It's up to, and this is Prop 98 is the minimum spending that the state must give to education. And unless they suspend it, that's the floor for spending. It's at $61.6 billion for the 14-15 year. That's a $6.3 billion increase, or 11.4%. That's a huge increase over 13-14. On average, per ADA for education, it's an ongoing $751 per student. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to necessarily get an extra $751. That's an average statewide, although because we have high concentration in supplemental grants, we're more likely to get a higher share of it. So that will be good for us. In addition to the 14-15 Prop 98 estimate, they're shoring up the Prop 98, the actual Prop 98 for year 12-13 and 13-14, and so there's additional funds, because just as this is a forecast for what the Prop 98 is going to be in 14-15, they also forecasted in the other years, and now we know what those years are, and so there's an additional $1.8 billion for 12-13 and $1.5 billion for 13-14. Those are one-time funds, and so the one-time funds are usually spent for one-time purposes. So how does the governor propose that we spend the money on education? Well, because we do have a lot of one-time funds. We have $3.3 billion from past years. He wants to take that as well as some of the current additional Prop 98 funds and buy back all the remaining inter-year apportionment deferrals, so $5.5 billion. And there's still the community college inter-year deferrals, and he's buying that back too, but it's not coming from this money that we're talking about right now. So that's a one-time expense, just as when they put the deferrals into place, it was a one-time savings. When they buy it back, it's a one-time expense. So next year, they won't have to buy any of these back because they'll be gone. And so the ongoing money will be able to be used for other purposes. Maybe there'll be some for one-time purposes, but this won't have to be bought back again as long as they don't do deferrals again. So this is a portion of that wall of debt. There's a lot of other things. It's about 10% of the total wall of debt. But this is the one that's specifically in education. And then there's a lot of liability for retirement. That's part of the wall of debt, and a lot of other things. Then in addition to buying back the deferrals, he wants to put $4.5 billion towards funding the LCF gap. So, and I'll show you that in a little bit. So that is a 28% funding of the remaining gap. That's what that would do. And that is an average of $755 per student. It's an increase of almost 11% for students by funding that additional amount of the LCFF. And again, different districts will get different amounts depending on their unduplicated count. And then there's this COLA. The COLA for other state programs that are not included in the LCFF, like for us, special ed, child nutrition, for the lunch program, not the breakfast program. So even though, well, I'll talk about the COLA in the LCF a little bit better. And then there's other programs. These are just a couple of the significant ones. Funding of Prop 39 emergency efficiency projects, as well as emergency repair programs, and there's a bunch of other small ones. But the really big ones are the buyback and the funding of the LCFF.
So does this mean that some districts could possibly have a ADA of 1,500?
I'm sorry.
You mean an increase of?
Well, the ADA says on average 751 per ADA on Proposition 98, and then down there you have the statewide average increase of 10.9%.
No, because see, this is Prop 90. This money is being used to fund this.
All right. Yeah.
Okay, so what it translates into, when you take this money, if we just took the money that they've got, the additional monies of Prop 98, it would be $751 per student. But then the governor says, well, how are we going to use that money? And so this is how he's going to use it. And it's a higher amount because this is for everybody, and not all districts are going to get that much money. So for the LCFF, it's so most of it's coming mostly through the LCFF. Good question. Okay, so this is just for your refresher. It's what the LCFF is made up again of, and this is for the target of the LCFF. We have our base grant, which again is by grade span, and that is going up by the COLA, and also this was 723 or 721 last year, and now it's 729 because it's going up as well. The part that's instead of the class size reduction, that gets added to the base grant. Now, when you look at the COLA here, I just want to kind of let you know that when we're adding COLA to the target, it means the target is going up. It doesn't mean that we're getting it.
Getting closer.
Okay? We are getting money, but the target, when we get to the final payment we'll realize that whole amount. Or you could say, well, let's count it as we're getting that, and we're not getting any other stuff. But, so this isn't like in addition to it all, this is just pushing that target up higher, which is good that at least it's adding to the target.
Well, it's very important, that was something I think I asked once before, about the target be adjusted to inflation, because
Yes.
otherwise we'll get there and we'll be getting 1998 amounts or whatever it was, and oops, that's not worth so much anymore.
Exactly.
So, very important to adjust to the target.
Yeah. So that's our base grant, and this is what everybody will get. They will, every school district will get the same dollar amount for their base grant, provided they're doing the class size reduction. If they're not, then they'll lose that. If we're not, we'll lose that, but we're going to. We're not going to lose it. We're going to do it. And then there's the add-on grants, and they are, as you know, that they are funded on the level of our unduplicated count. So our free and reduced, our EL students, our foster youth. If you fit in all three of those categories, you get counted once. If you fit in two of the categories, you get counted once. So we go by our unduplicated count. And for the supplemental grant, we will get 20% of the base times the percentage of students that we have that are in the unduplicated count. And our unduplicated count, we now know, is 73.7% for this year. Then we also have the concentration grant. And so with the concentration grant, instead of 20% of the base grant, it's 50% of the base grant. But it's only times the number of unduplicated count that is above 55%. Okay, so the difference between 73.5% and 55%. So it's like, what, 18.5% on that. So those get added. And then we have these just additional add-ons, the TIG and the home to school transportation. Those do not get COLA. They're just add-on every year, the same amount. And so it will be less, the value will be less and less and less, but we will be getting it. So that's just a little refresher to tell you how we get to our target. And we have a calculator, and it's both FCMAC have it and school services has it, and that's where we put our information in order to determine what kind of funding we're going to get. Okay, so this is coming from our calculator. So this is where we are. So we have, as I said, 73.7% unduplicated count. This, again, is our target. But it's our target where we'd be with just adding that 0.86% COLA. So it's not continuing, in this sample, it's not continuing the out years like 2.2% or whatever those out year COLAs are. So this is just for next year, for the 14-15 year, and this is just the target right now. So we have our base grant plus those to the TIG and the transportation. This is the amount we're going to be getting for it. Well, this is the amount, I'm sorry, this is the amount that's going to the target for it. Supplemental grant, $6.7 million towards the target. Concentration grant, $4.3 million towards the target. So our target in 14-15 is $57 million, $57.3 million. So now what we do is we look at what is our floor? Where are we right now for, basically it's a 13-14 year. Our 13-14 year makes the floor for the 14-15 year. We are getting this year $39 million of the target that we had, which was a little bit less than this because it was for last year. So when you look at what our target is for next year, and you subtract out the floor amount that we're going to get, the minimum amount we can get, we have a funding gap of $18 million. And so that is our target. Now I'm going to tell you about our expected revenues for next year, according to what the governor has proposed. So we start out with our floor, which is right here, becomes our beginning point for next year. And then the governor is proposing that we fund 28.05% of the gap. So here's the gap. 28.05% of that gap is just over $5 million. So we add it to it, and we have $44 million is what we will be budgeting. We will be putting that into our budget, because obviously we don't actually have time to wait for the budget to be adopted by the state. When the May revise comes, we will adjust that part accordingly. But in the meantime, we are going to start building our budget using the information that we have. So one of the things I want to point out in this $5 million extra dollars that we're getting is, you know what? If you look at the supplemental and the concentration grants, that's $11 million that has to go that for those. When we are fully funded, we will need to spend $11 million with next year, based on next year's money. If we were funded the full target next year, we would have to spend this full $11 million for concentration and supplemental grant purposes. So that is to help our struggling students.
That would be a good problem if we had $11 million to spend, though, right?
It would be a good problem, and that problem would, yeah, we have work to do. And we'll get to that work that we have to do in order to spend some money. So for this year, we only have to spend $1 million of our, just over $1 million on the students, because we have to match what we did last year. So it's like 1.1 million on the students that this money would be earmarked for. Okay, so we're spending 1 million or a little over 1 million, and we got to get to 11 million. So basically, this $5 million that we have here, of that 5 million, I've calculated that between 2.8 million and 4.1 million of this money will have to be spent for concentration and supplemental grant purposes next year. So that leaves only somewhere between 0.9 million, so just under $1 million, to 2.2 million of these funds would be for basic purposes, general purposes, which would include regular instruction, which would also include facilities, would include clerical support, will include PG&E, everything like that. So we're looking somewhere between $1 to $2 million base funds, and then the rest of those funds will have to be used for supplemental purposes and concentrating purposes. So you guys are familiar with this. I do this all the time. The interim reports, the proposed budget, this is the multi-year projection. And this is the multi-year projection that we used for the first interim, and the only changes we made, because you'll have an updated second interim. Then we'll make other changes. But for simplicity, I only changed it so that we would use the whatever new COLAs they had, the 28.05% increase in LCFF funding. Because if you recall, we had the 4.5%, and then the following year we had 5.5%. Following year we still have it the 5.5. But for 14-15, we've increased the income to include this additional 28.05, where we only had 4.5, it's now 28.05. So that's included, and then we adjusted to our true unduplicated count that at this point is close to our final certification, and that's where we're at. And that's a snapshot of time for October CBEDS. This is our CBEDS information. So given this change, that's the only thing that's been changed here. if you look at our fund balance, you can see that we're increasing.
Mhm.
On the next page, you'll be able to see it a little better. 14-15, the fund balance increases by $4.8 million. 15-16, $5.2 million. 16-17, $6 million. And that is because there are no changes here to the expenditures for those increased expenses that we will have to help those struggling students at this point, because this is what we're working on now. So here's that fund balance. And of course, we know that this is not going to happen, okay? This is not going to happen because that would mean we did nothing with that money. And we are going to be doing stuff with that money, and that is the LCAP. That's what Ms. McCulloch has been talking about. That's what all these meetings are about. This is what engaging parents, staff, students, community this is our tool, is how we're going to educate all the children. We're going to identify the goals based on the state priorities for all students, and we're going to determine our priorities in those goals. And then we're going to have to list out the actions that we're going to implement to accomplish those goals, including the expand and improve services for the our struggling students. And then we're going to describe those expenditures that are supporting those actions, and how can we find them in the budget? Where will they be in the budget? We'll identify expected outcomes, demonstrate progress, and measure achievement. And all that is part of the LCAP. And we are going to endeavor to identify through our coding system, as much as reasonably possible, the expenditures that we are putting towards the supplemental and the concentration grant types of expenditures, so that we can monitor what we're doing. So our timeline and our next steps. Well, the LCAP comes first. That LCAP has to be adopted by the board before we can adopt the budget. After the LCAP is adopted, we still have to adopt that budget before June 30th. And in doing so, in developing the budget, we are going to have some clear assumptions. And really right now, those clear assumptions for us are increasing the funding by that $5 million. And the expenditure portion is going to be, is the difficult part right now, because that is based on the LCAP. We're not going to necessarily have time to make all the necessary changes after the LCAP comes in. So what's going to happen, first off, when the state adopts the budget, if there's major changes, we'll have 45 days to revise our budget to speak to those changes. But bigger than that, and I didn't even put a bullet down here because I think it would be way too big, this is going to be a provisional budget, because we're going to have a lot of changes next year as we start funding to the LCAP. And figuring out what is the best way to code it. So it's going to be provisional, and we're going to get it to as much in it as we can with the information that we have. But the LCAP is going to be key to what ends up happening. And it'll come in the first interim. We'll have the opportunity to go over and see, you know, what we've done, what changes we've made as a result of the LCAP. Questions?
First.
Going back to how we are funded from the state and how we
Particular
use it.
slide?
Yeah. I think slide 10.
Okay.
Though the states uses the phrase target, it's not a promise. So Is it still is it a moving target, how much we're going to get funded? Or I guess the question becomes, I'm sorry, slide 9. What's our confidence that we're going to get that gap funding, that 28.05 proposed gap funding?
good.
Oh, pretty good.
Pretty good.
Okay.
And of course, as the years go on, that gap funding will always be whatever percentage of that gap is there. So eventually, the last year, it's going to be 100%. So it's 28% of a smaller amount because last year, or the current year, the gap was funded 11.78%. So that made the gap smaller. So now the new 100% gap will be funded 28%. It's hard to say what legislature will do, but the thing is that Prop 98, they've got to fund Prop 98. And they're committed to the LCFF. And there's only so many deferrals we can buy back because they're gone. Once he buys them, they're gone. And so you have to fund something. And since they're committed to it and they've got the funds to do it, I believe they will do that.
Does that mean then, this is the part I'm not completely clear on even yet, next year, will the funding floor be based, I mean, for the following year, so this is the
So
14,
15,
15. So
16?
15, 16, will it be, the funding floor be based on what we got in what we actually got in
Yes.
14, 15? So,
Yes.
okay, so the
our
floor,
minimum will be the 44.
rise, the floor will rise as well, so
Yes. And what'll
they only
happen
do- okay.
is, let's say there was no COLA. Let's just say there was no COLA to keep it static. This $18 million gap, it'll drop by $5 million, so it'll be a $13 million gap
Right,
following year.
right. Okay,
The
so
gap-
then next year, even if they only fund 5% of the gap, we're still getting more than we got this year.
Yes.
Got it. That was
It
the part
becomes
that
our new
was
floor.
buzzing.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, that helps.
And then just on slide 10, which kind of does our out years, at last meeting, we talked about the recognition of pension liabilities. How does that affect, I guess, I remember when we did the Sarbanes-Oxley for public companies, they had to factor in what was called FAS 123 into their net income reporting, in which they adjusted for pension liabilities and retirement and other stock option expense, and then came up with a different earnings model. When are we going to start to
Okay, so
talk about that? So I guess it would go total available reserves minus pension liabilities, which would be the available reserves?
no.
No?
It won't
Okay.
be on our financials, on our books like this. It'll be only in the financial statements. It'll be a note in the financial statements recognizing what our potential liability would be if the state couldn't pay. Like, for instance, we've issued bonds. Those bonds, we put those bonds into our financial statements. We're not going to pay them off unless the community became a ghost town and everybody bailed and there was nobody left to pay their property taxes. That's when it becomes our liability. So in the same situation, if the state doesn't, if the investments aren't prudent and we don't, build up that reserve more, it's a potential future liability. But it won't show up on these, on the financials that you're used to seeing. It'll show up in the financial report that the auditor presents.
What will change, as Ms. Kessler said, is we're going to increase our activities and our programs, so that will impact those out-year balances once the LCAP is written and we've monetized what that costs. Also, getting to your point, Mr. Otidy, on pension liabilities, that is a topic of conversation that has been certainly on this governor's mind for the last 2 or 3 years. And there does seem to be some movement, especially right now as the economy is starting to turn around, to begin to address that. And what I've heard is that it's a three-part addressing it. One is the state increasing their contributions toward that liability. Second, the employer increasing the contributions for our current employees, and also current employees increasing their own personal contributions toward that. And I think Ms. Dart mentioned at a previous board meeting, currently teachers, or those in the teacher retirement system, contribute about 8% of their income, annual income, toward their pension liability, their pensions, which is far greater than many other public employees do, and probably even far better than most private employees do. Few people have the discipline to contribute that much, but those in the public retirement, state teachers retirement system, don't have a choice. It just happens, which is good for them, good for us, but also there is a realization across the board that everybody does need to increase their contribution, and so Ms. Kessler referred to it a bit, that there is now a surplus in the sense that the state has an opportunity to begin to pay back that wall of debt. But at the same time, there's an acknowledgement by most people that it is an employer's responsibility as well as the individual's responsibility to increase contribution. So how that all plays out, we don't know, but it will play out in some way.
And if the employer would be required to pay a higher contribution, then that will increase the expense portion. And so that portion, and that would be on, like, instead of 8.25%, 8.5%, whatever it happens to be. So that would increase our expenses. And for, like Mr. Vidalis was saying, a PERS employee pays 7%, but then they pay an additional 6.2% to Social Security. So you add those two together, and you're at 13%.
I had a question about slide 9 as well, just for the proposed gap funding, so the $5 million.
Mm-hmm.
I think you may have said it, but I just want to be clear. Do all of those funds have to be used towards the supplemental and concentration areas?
No.
No.
Approximately between $1 and $2.2 million of that will be for basic services.
All right.
The remaining amount, it would be, my calculation,
About
quick calculation on this, of that 5 million, somewhere between 2.8 and 4.1 million of those funds would be for the supplemental or concentration grant purposes.
All right.
And that should be sifted out through the LCAP.
Right.
Services that would be provided that those funds would be paying for. So that's what's really important, that we all kind of work together and figure out what we need to do. And to appropriately charge expenditures if they are for those purposes, where, you know, maybe before we never really thought about it. Maybe we just said, oh, we're doing the EIA, and we're
Right.
doing this to help them too, but, you know, we're just using unrestricted money, so we're not really, like, calling it that. So now we got to call it what it is and put it to that. If that's what it is, if that's what it's supporting, then that's where we want it to show up.
Right. So does that mean that we may possibly spend more than the 2.8 million?
An additional 2.8. We already have $1 million that we're spending.
All right, so we're already
it's-
spending $1
yeah,
million.
between 2.8 and 4.1. So you take that and you add that to the $1 million that we're already spending, and we would be at either 3.8 or 5.1, and eventually we've got to be at 11 million.
So when they set the target, they don't, they're not funding the full target. So do they say you have to use a certain amount of the gap funding towards?
That's how I calculated
All
it.
right.
So they said, basically, you take the gap, you take the, in our case, you take these two amounts combined, which is $11 million,
Right. That's what I'm
and then you take the amount that you spent last year, So like 1.3 million, we'll just say it's 1 million, because it makes it a lot easier, okay? So you take the 11 million, you subtract out the 1 million, and so you end up with $10 million. And so basically, it's a 2.8%, or 28% of that 10 million, which is an additional 2.8 million. That was the lower part. The reason why I have a higher part is because what are they going to, like, we had carryover from another year, and so it kind of makes it a little bit cloudy. Are they going to use just the granted amount that we had? Are they going to use the expenditure amount that we had? Are they going to use
Budgeted amount.
some of the amount that we spent this year? They also say you've got to pull it from other source, so that's why I gave it a span of minimum of 2.8 million, and I figure it's safe to go as high as 4.1. We just don't know the answer to that yet.
All right.
But we have until the end for that, but we definitely want to make steady progress toward that. We don't want to end up in 2021 having only continued to spend 1 million on those services, and then all of a sudden need to pay the piper and
Right.
say, no, we need to make $12 million worth of cuts so that we can do all these
To
other
pay for
services.
those programs, yeah.
So we definitely want to make steady progress to getting toward where we need to be.
But that was partly why I asked, like, should we be allocating $11 million towards
Not yet.
Yeah.
We're going to get there.
in 8 years?
It would be very difficult to do that and spend it in any intelligent and meaningful way.
Yeah.
Although I wouldn't necessarily put it beyond Sacramento to think that we ought to just
To do it.
just do it.
And there may be some districts who will take that approach.
Right.
It will not surprise me if there will be some districts who will spend it all now on today and not think about tomorrow. And then in 2021, they're going to be crying that they don't have money to be able to fund what they need to
What
fund.
they've been doing every year.
Because they've been using it for other purposes, and there are definitely other districts who are very hungry. Like they've been in negative certifications, they're underwater.
Right.
And so there's a temptation to not appropriately.
And also because all of our school sites have at least 40% unduplicated count, it gives us a little bit more flexibility, school-wise, district-wide, as how we can spend those funds to support our students. So but we have to kind of figure it out.
In a sense, it's hard for us to spend money that's not supporting those students
Correct.
because
Yeah.
they are our district.
Right.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. If there are no further questions, we're going well over time on this. So if nobody's got other pressing urges for clarification, I'm going to thank Ms. Kessler and
Thanks.
move on to the next item,
This was good news.
which I believe is also still yours. The correction in the increase to the retiree salary.
That would be Ms. Hopkins.
It's actually mine,
yours.
because it's,
Claim it.
yeah, I have to apologize for having to come to you with this correction, but the retiree teacher salary increase was calculated incorrectly. It came out, and the last time you approved it as $272 a day, and that's incorrect. It should be $265 a day. That makes the 6% increase. But we do want to align it to step 3, column 2 on the regular teacher salary schedule. And it would be effective February 1st, so we found this mistake in time to stick with our timetable. So this salary of $265 a day for retired teachers when they are working on through a personal services agreement. If they do day-to-day subbing, they get a day-to-day sub rate, but when they're doing special work for us, they get this other rate. So this represents a 6% increase from this previous rate of $250 a day.
So this is purely fixing up the math and
The error I made,
getting the numbers right.
So this is a good example of checks and balances in our district, and
Did we catch
you
that?
don't always see all the checks and balances, but this one you get to see.
You get to see it.
You get to see this one. Usually they get caught before.
It's a good thing.
It's a good
Yes,
thing. No,
it is.
the auditor commented on separation of duties, and
Right.
Right.
Well, and it's
we have
not-
that. So
It's not bad to model. You've got to proofread, you've got to, make corrections. So I don't think this requires any particular discussion unless somebody needs more clarification on.
Well, I just want to ask, did the teachers, were they informed of this mistake? Did they even know that we passed this and that they were getting a raise?
Well, those who read or listened to the meeting may have known, but I'm assuming most people didn't know. But the person who uses a lot of retired teachers is for our EL program, and Mr. Mosher does know of the mistake, so.
All right.
Then we have a motion.
I make a motion to make a correction to the salary increase for retired teachers and to correctly state it at, is it 265?
60.
$265 a day, effective February 1st, 2014.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? All right, we're getting there, gang. Board policies. Does anybody?
So just for Mr. Waters, for your edification, I guess, these policies come to the board 2 times. They come for what's called a first reading, so that if there's any corrections or questions or things on the policies, they can come out now as a first reading. We would make any changes or explanations, and then they come forth to the board for a second reading. And then once they're voted on, at that point is when they become policy. So this is a first reading. So if there are any questions or clarifications sought based on the first reading, I'd be happy to try to answer those. And sometimes I can't answer them, and so I need to get back to you. So.
I'd like to motion to accept the first reading.
Second.
Fairly on top of that. We have a motion and a second to accept the first reading. We still have another chance to make sure we didn't miss anything before the next meeting and the second reading, so, all those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Well, that was brisk. That brings us to reports from board members on professional development, and that is moi. And I have my report on the CSBA conference. I apologize, I didn't use any fancy backgrounds because I couldn't figure out how to make them when I made it go in this orientation, which I had to do for just one slide. And I had to change the entire thing. One of these days, I'm going to learn to use PowerPoint properly. So at the CSBA Annual Education Conference, I chose to focus my attention primarily on the Common Core, and I went to a few sessions on the LCFF, but since at that time, we didn't really know that was there was a lot of speculation, so I really put the focus in on the Common Core questions. A couple of the best sessions that I attended then were one called Building a Strong Foundation, Common Core in Kindergarten and First Grade, and Finding the Commons in Common Core for Your Schools. And that one I'm going to go to on first. The entire session was a powerful argument for full-time school libraries and trained certificated teacher librarians. You can't imagine. I'm sorry, can you bring your microphone just a bit closer? Oh, I'm sorry. You can't imagine, of course, why I would have any vested interest in seeing our libraries and librarians be restored and funded and so forth. But I was pretty impressed with the data and information that they brought to us, especially as regards our upper grades, since we don't have high school, particularly our middle school libraries. But really, it applies to all grades. So some of the things they brought up, talking about first, we have the changing standards for English language arts with a shift towards a balance of informational and narrative texts, increasing complexity through the year, each year to stretch the readers, text-dependent questions where they've got to learn to look. This is stuff I was trying to teach the students I was teaching in freshman English in college, and even in other literature classes. Go to the text. What does the text say? We're talking about teaching this to fourth graders. Emphasize the use of evidence to inform and make an argument. And then something we've seen a lot here, academic vocabulary. the focus on comprehension of pivotal and commonly found words, the ways we talk about things at school. So this is really kind of shifting, as was mentioned earlier. We're shifting from that mile wide, inch deep. The previous program, our previous requirements, what the STAR was mostly measuring were what you call level 1 and 2 understandings, recall, basic skills and concepts. Common Core is pushing us to levels 3 and 4 of strategic thinking and extended thinking. And so, of course, we raised the question, where do they learn it? At the library. And I really should get a copy of this one to everyone, because here we have a whole lot of pullouts, and I actually have the documentation of the studies that they're using to get these things. But one of the things you see, you know, 37% of all Americans do not have access to high-speed broadband at home. You know, a strong school library can help bridge that gap. You know, we talk about the digital gap, digital divide. 21 state studies confirm that school librarians support student achievement. When school spending for school libraries rises, better reading scores follows. These aren't, in a sense, this isn't rocket science. You would kind of expect if you have libraries and you have trained librarians who are available to help the students make use of it, their performance improves. You know, the teacher librarian, since I was using it as quickly, is a person who actually has 2 credentials. They are a credentialed teacher. They have a subject area degree. They have a credential in teaching library, I don't know how you exactly put that, but being
Library
a librarian,
science.
library science. They're ready to teach those research skills, digital literacy, and to collaborate. And this is something they kept coming back with, to collaborate with the other teachers, to collaborate with the administration, to work on what we do. Of course, the librarian also curates the collections. What does that mean? That means that maybe they go through and they see that that book that I once carefully returned to the Tobias Library that had been returned at Westlake City Library instead, that was all about the state of Hawaii and was dated in the year of my birth, and I'm not going to say what, but trust me, Hawaii was a very new state then. Maybe we could, you know, be replacing things like that if we had the people. Matching students to the right text, that's something that's a constant challenge. We see that come into, and that's not just what text you need to be writing your paper, but also when the kid comes in and, you know, you got to take a book home. Do they grab the first book off the shelf, or is there somebody there who could help them find the book that's at their reading level, that meets their interests, that they might actually sit down and read? How to read different kinds of texts, how to use, and then this big one, because this relates back to that requirement of 50% nonfiction text. How do we do reading instruction across the curriculum? How are, you know, this is the person who is supposed to have the training to help our teachers to learn how do we teach writing and math, reading in math class? You know, what are we reading? What are we reading that's relating to science? How do we read a science book? So, and I just liked this quote here, that libraries are at the center between formal and informal learning. Libraries by mission are all about self-directed learning. Wander around the library, find what you find. At the same time, of course, self-directed learning can always use a little bit of a boost when you're lost in the stacks. So the other session I wanted to focus on, and I'm kind of zinging through this because it is late, was a session put on by the Clovis Unified School District, and they have been teaching the Common Core standards. They started a rollout in grades kindergarten and first grade 3 years ago. So I don't know quite how they did that, because I didn't even think the standards were developed yet then. But
Just began to be adopted.
right, they were just beginning. So they jumped on, I guess they jumped on that right from the beginning. Worked on establishing professional development, curriculum, pacing guides, benchmarks, and aligned report cards. And I hope they're sharing that with other people, because, God, that's a lot of work, and having every school district reinvent the wheel seems a terrible waste.
We do it better, I'm sure.
Well, we might
Cool.
have, you know, we could refine their wheel rather than
Right.
starting from scratch,
That's usually
though.
what we do.
So one of the things that they came up with in developing their model was this Prove It model that was basically focused, as it would suggest, on how children to explain how they know what they know. And this kind of, my impression was this really spread through even